My urban geography classroom is set up based on the westernized academic standards. In a large, two-story brick school, my classroom is nestled between two identical rooms. The structure, similar to all the other classrooms in the school. Within the room, there is a teacher's desk and rows of students' desks, instructional wall-mounted boards, and basic technology to share information with students. When you look around, you see mandated health and safety information, clocks, schedules, expectations, and endless drones of organization. Within these four walls, learning does not just happen, it is expected. Largely, the classroom environment is structured around what pre-exists. Every classroom in the school has the same two walls of blackboards, one wall of bulletin boards, and if you're lucky, some windows. Above you are two rows of headache-inducing lights, and below you is a hard plastic chair and freshly waxed tile. There is little character to the environment, little opportunity for creativity. Why? Simply because this is the structure of a traditional classroom. This structure is reflective of political socialization, a concept that is employed in childhood and expands throughout one's life. Within the traditional structure, teachers are given authority, and children become dependent and submissive. While we know this is not what classrooms today should look like, without extensive revamping and organization, this is how they will remain. The focus of this investigation is at the secondary level, deeply exploring the geography curriculum within the Ontario secondary education structure. On the surface, the Ministry of Education appears to be ensuring equality for all students. The Ministry of Education recognizes that each student has unique interests, goals, and strengths. To focus on this, the Ministry has decided the top priority is high-quality course options inside and outside of the classroom, and more one-on-one support through the Student Success Strategy. This strategy is geared toward a more proactive approach that allows students to engage with their school experience. While this is seemingly effective, the outdated approach overlooks the root component of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, published 1 year prior to the latest Ministry of Education update. Within the calls to action, the government is called upon to develop culturally appropriate curricula and to incorporate Indigenous peoples in this process. With this realization, I question, how is the Ministry of Education indigenizing education within the classroom and within curriculum? Such a question is imperative to ask when investigating an urban classroom, as a sustained Western approach to education does not meet the needs of the classroom demographics today. When Westernized approaches dominate a classroom, there is little attention given to the unique needs of students beyond the standard differentiation. Batiste suggests that decolonization is only on the minds of those who are forward-thinking and whom believe the earth is significant enough to warrant protection, as colonial mentality simply endangers and subjugates people around the world. Indigenous peoples live in a community where they acquire, develop, and sustain relationships with each other and within their environments. The sustained colonial approach simply does not meet that expectation. Windsor-Essex demographics for 2016 show that the typical classroom has extreme cultural diversity, which does not parallel the colonial dominant classroom structures and curricular approaches. Ontario has the second highest rate of visible minorities in Canada, with nearly a third of the population identifying within this category. Within the province, there is a broad range of ethnic categorizations which students identify. Specifically, in Windsor-Essex, visible minorities are quite prevalent in the classroom, representative of a diverse society and imposing the necessity for educators to reappraise their approaches to education to meet the needs of these students. Unfortunately, the school board does not have FNMI data, but a 2016 Statistics Canada census provides similar information. The census study determines that more than 8,500 people within Windsor-Essex identify as having Indigenous ancestry, making up approximately 4% of the total population. It is likely these numbers are incorrect, as this does not take into consideration regions outside of Windsor, nor does it take into consideration the First Nations reserves, Walpole Island, or Caldwell First Nations, which account for nearly 2,000 more people. With this considered, it becomes apparent that there are little considerations from the board in forms of identifying FNMI students within the board. Even though there are FNMI support units within the board and ministry documents supporting FNMI programming, the lack of recognition within the report from the board suggests that there is no concrete representation or expectation within the classroom either. This must quickly be given attention, as classrooms that are culturally diverse cannot be suppressed under the veils of a linear perspective, such as that of a colonial foundation. The effects of westernized education systems can adversely affect all students, but for Indigenous student populations, the effects are detrimental. Settler Canadian curricula often reflects the lives of voyagers and not of the Indigenous people who were also present during the development of the nation. The difficulty with focusing on the voyager in the modern time, Euro-dominant perspective, is that these glorified perspectives take away from the quality and value of other perspectives. Specifically, when teaching the fur trade, trapper and trader games are commonly used. Within the game, there are limited components that acknowledge how ambivalent this period of history was. These illustrations create narratives that are inaccurate but remain dominant discourse, swaying the perception of learners and citizens in regard to larger social issues. As well, the sustained Western values imposed by the use of Eurocentric language and culture throughout society represses the Indigenous peoples. Limitations exist within their efforts towards land claims, self-government, self-determination, residential school healing initiatives, language revitalization, and Indigenous research. These limitations exist because support that should be directed towards them is geared towards the dominant ideology, an ideology that is linear and focused on Eurocentrism.
There is a way that Indigenous people live in relation to land that we've kind of gotten away from when we talk about education.
Land-based Indigenous studies for me is the mixing of culture, knowledge, and then bringing forth that kind of traditional understanding of what land and science, food sustainability, and spirit mean.
If we're going to be comparing it between a mainstream and a land-based education system, the differences would be things like a classroom is a colonial system of education. Chairs, desks, writing utensils, that's all colonial education. So land-based education really brings people to the land and understanding the relationships with the land, all the things that the land produces that have relationships with each other.
When we learn more about best practices for incorporating Indigenous worldviews into classrooms and curriculums, we discover that we really need to be taking students outside and connecting them with the land and connecting them with Indigenous knowledge keepers and community members.
I am focusing on my classroom alone, a geography classroom in an urban setting. Making changes to indigenized geography doesn't have to be difficult, as indigeneity is at the core of geography education in Canada. Unfortunately, due to the stark contrast between Indigenous and Western worldviews, there's a lack of integration in this curriculum and often overlooked in the classroom. While all of these methods of indigenization can be effective, the specific focus of this classroom investigation is place-based versus land-based approaches to determine which is more appropriate and beneficial. In general, land education puts Indigenous epistemological and ontological accounts of land at the center, including Indigenous understandings of land, Indigenous language in relation to land, and Indigenous critiques of settler colonialism. Place-based education centers learning within local communities and has been traditionally associated with rural endeavors. Place-based education also incorporates hands-on approaches, coupling learning with real-world significance by promoting active ideas of citizenship in places students inhabit. Unfortunately, despite the emphasis on community needs and engagements, they do not go far enough to promote decolonizing goals that should be included in any place-based education model, interested in cultural and ecological sustainability. Suggested elements that require consideration for place-based education models and practices include the following: centering the relationship between land and settler colonialism from an Indigenous perspective to ensure ideologies and structures are explicit and that relationships with place are formed away from the settler construct. Considering the politics of naming, which explores pedagogy in the analysis of political norms which are continuing at the expense of Indigenous peoples. Focusing on decolonizing re-inhabitation of place, which is more than simply promoting neoliberal sustainability environmental practices and more towards how settlers access territory. Consideration of Indigenous agency and resistance, which is tied to Indigenous cosmologies. Destabilizing the local, focusing on how ethics of land are informed by dominant ideologies. When applying Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies into the urban geography classroom, it is imperative to have a strong grasp of what these are and how they can be implemented. The Association of Canadian Deans of Education describes goals that allow educators to indigenize their classrooms with more ease. That the implementation can only be successful for the student population. The Saskatchewan Teachers Federation reflects on their integration of land-based education and determines that students became more engaged, attended class more often, and had higher rates of graduation when this was employed. Within the program, students are learning science, social studies, language arts, and life skills, while learning to live and survive off the land. They are learning how to hunt, fish, trap, and collect plant samples, which are vital to revitalization of Indigenous approaches to education. As well, the students learn to understand the ethics of the land and how to engage in reciprocal relationships with the land. Students are given the opportunity to interact with learning from the land, learning from the environment, the things that surround us. In my own classroom, there are minor changes that I have made so far to the structure that allows for decolonization. As for collaboration, I have recently invited Tyler White, our school's FNMI support worker, to speak to my class to share his story. Within the geography classroom, we learn about issues that are relevant in Canada and deeply focus on the current equality in our nation. It is very important for the story of Indigenous peoples in Canada to be told truthfully, but also authentically, which has led to my invitation of Tyler White into my classroom. This also tied into the focus on oral traditions and storytelling as an opportunity for histories and traditions to be shared. Since each person is the carrier of history, it is vital to have that aspect of narrative be incorporated. Moving forward, there will always be changes in my classroom that are better for the environment for my students and to create educational learning experiences that are inclusive and diverse. It's a worldview that takes a long time to learn how to do it respectfully, even for those who are Indigenous. This quote ties into the most crucial and critical Indigenous pedagogies, the belief that knowledge is experiential and lifelong, requiring meaningful experiences, interconnection of people, land, and place. The approaches in geography are constantly changing, as is content that we are learning about our world and the people on it. Therefore, as we grow, we will learn more about indigenizing our classrooms, and we will learn better ways of employing this in a just and honorable way.